You're a storyteller. Obviously, you are sensitive because you've paid attention to what's around you, and you have as much right to tell the story as anybody else. And I think sometimes it's important to tell those stories. I haven't been constrained because I recognize that there aren't many storytellers who get published in my family. And I think we have an interesting story to tell.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Juliet Gilkes Romero, a stage and screenwriter, and my guest today is Colin Grant, a former BBC Arts producer and cultural historian who's chronicled the lives of the Caribbean people and their migration to Britain. Colin's books include Bag Eye at the Wheel, shortlisted for the PEN Accolade Prize, and Homecoming, Voices of the Windrush Generation, a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week. A personal favourite of mine is an extraordinary, tender memoir about a beloved brother with epilepsy called A Smell of Burning. His latest book is I'm Black, So You Don't Have to Be. His oral history of migration to Britain, What We Leave We Carry, will be published in 2025. Infamously, Colin holds the record for the most disciplinary hearings ever brought against a BBC employee. And as a former and fellow employee, I look forward to unpicking that story. Colin and I will be chatting about his life as a writer, and we'll be taking a deep dive into the Royal Literary Fund archive, featuring a huge range of fellow creatives discussing different aspects of their experience and process. Welcome, Colin.
Thanks, Juliet. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. It's great to have you in the studio because this is the kind of environment where I first met you at BBC World Service Radio. But I'd like to go back a little further to your education and school days. Because, as like me, you won a place to an independent Catholic school, St. Columba's. You were born just outside of Luton in Hitchin. You're of Jamaican heritage. You came from a working class community. What was it like going to that Catholic independent school?
It was a revelation. I think I went there because when I got to the age of 10, 11, my parents recognized that I had good brains. They were feeding me all the fish that they could get their hands on, but it wasn't going to work. I was destined for the failing state school. It's called Rotherham. In fact, it closed down a few years later, so they weren't wrong. So there was a lot of excitement about the idea that I would go to this private school. There was a lot of money involved, a lot of commitment involved. And I should point out that at that time, there's only one wage coming into the house. I was one of 5 children at the time. My father worked at Vauxhall Motors. He's called Bag Eye because he had these permanent bags under his eyes. And my mother convinced him that they'd have to do something. They'd have to scrimp and save and send me to this private school. My father realized that the only way he could do that was to supplement his income. And at this point, I always say to people, my education was funded by marijuana. So my father was a small-time ganja dealer. I think he thought he was practicing kind of social service rather than committing a crime. I was his bag man. We would drive around Luton in his banged-up old mini estate, dropping off the little sachets of marijuana to his Caribbean friends. And through that process, I was able to go to St. Columba's College in St. Albans, which I thoroughly enjoyed. It was a great college, but the school was run by American monks. They're brothers of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And in a way, both me and my brother, who also went there, benefited from, in a way, the civil rights movement in America, because I think the monks there were rather ashamed about what had been done to Black people in America in their name. And so they treated us royally, my brother and I. But I should say, Juliet, that crime doesn't pay. So eventually, we are raided by the police in Luton. A van pulls up outside of our house, a big white van. I liken it to a Trojan horse. Outside of this Trojan horse comes 12 policemen with their shovels and their forks. They dig up the front garden, they dig up the back garden, they rifle through the house. They find a huge stash of marijuana. My father does not go to jail, but he goes on trial, but he charms the judge into just giving him quite a big sentence, but not a jail sentence. And what was kind of interesting about that was that this is in the early 70s. And at the time, there'd been a change in the legislation. In the year that my father was arrested, 700 people went to jail for possession in Britain, possession of marijuana. my father got off with a big fine. So he must have done something good. But I knew he was a charming fella because whenever we were driving around Luton in his car, me and my father, there were things in that car which ought not to be there, including the marijuana. And often we'd be stopped by the police. And I'll never forget my father's approach to that. We'd be stopped by the equivalent of PC blogs. And my father would promote him immediately. So PC blogs became Detective Inspector, sir. Chief Constable, sir. And he charmed his way into being set free. And that was a good lesson to learn, actually.
So off the back of that, actually, let's introduce our first archive clip, a letter to his younger self by poet and urban storyteller Donny O'Rourke.
Dear Donal, soon you will leave school. Leave Donny behind too. A wee boy's name. It's what your mother called you in protest at being pressurised into calling you Daniel after Dad. It is July 1977. You have just come back from scout camp. Mum is smiling on the doorstep, semaphoring your exam results. You can now take up a scholarship to spend your 6th year at a prestigious private school, and you can choose between the law faculties of Edinburgh and Glasgow. Oh, Donny boy, infiltrate that wealth-segregated sixth form. See how the other half, 4%, lives. What's a lawyer but a writer? You have recently beaten Charles Kennedy in the final of the Scottish Schools Debating Championship. You will succeed Peter Mandelson as chair of the British Youth Council, become an advocate, fight injustice, seek election. Poetry can plead, oppose, and be political without being polemical. Don't be cowed by class conditioning. The differential equation of social mobility can only be solved with an equal sign. Be neither chippy nor lippy. Defer only to merit. When someone praises you, do what Granny Quig recommended. Look them in the eye, smile and say, thank you. Accept the compliments I have spent a lifetime deflecting. Listeners will laud your fluency. Being articulate is like having green eyes or a thick head of hair. Don't overrate eloquence. Modesty is merely manners. Humility is a virtue. Heed the injunctions of the oracle at Delphi. Know thyself, nothing in excess. Don't blame others for your own deficiencies and derelictions. Success is to be savoured rather than walked away from. Has the phrase imposter syndrome been coined in the era of glam rock and punk? Rather than wait to be found out, I've given up on jobs I was good at and situations in which I was respected and admired. Try not to start the fire. You have to flee. At 17, you are Catholic boys' school shy of girls and drink. Don't become a Donny Juan. What alcohol provokes, it can never excuse. To settle down is not to settle for. Commit. Allow love. Dare to become a parent. Plump now. Banish the blubber. Maybe you will manage something else I never did. To think of yourself as a writer, not merely someone who writes. Asked if he had any regrets, Leonard Cohen quoted Piaf. Rien. Nothing. Lucky Lenny. Of course there has been joy and fulfilment, but I gladly spare you my myriad shames and blames. But I can't, because you won't heed my counsel. We meet our fate on the path we take to avoid it. Nomen est omen, as your Latin master taught you. Name is destiny. Only one Donny O'Rourke pops up when your name is Googled. Don't ask. It will still be science fictional until you are well over 30. And the even better news, you will be starting your RLF fellowship in 2015. When they ask the you I used to be to mail a missive back to me, for both our sakes, take his advice. About this epistle, please think twice.
So Donny's letter feels like a time-travelling call to action, urging us not to be cowed by class conditioning, to savour success, not walk away from it, and to ignore the spectre of imposter syndrome. Does that resonate with how you felt as a young man at Catholic school?
Not really, because I had parents and grandparents who really believed in me. In fact, I had a grandmother who lived in Wembley. And when I eventually leave school and go to university, every Sunday I'd go and have dinner with her and her Caribbean friends. And when I would arrive in the house, she would stop the conversation and call people to attention. And she'd say, as I walk through the door, you see the light above his head? Jesus is here. So I had a very high regard of myself. In fact, it took me a while to play down that kind of regard that I had for myself. So I was very confident. And also I'd been head boy at junior school, head boy at senior school. And I felt really at home in that regard. Also, I recognized that we were unlike the other children, my brother and I, because we weren't wealthy. All the boys were wealthy. So there was sometimes a little bit of discomfort in that knowledge. And I remember one incident when I felt a bit self-conscious about that fact, not about my abilities to get through the course, but what would happen at the end of a school day? What would happen when you were driven home after a game of rugby or football? And one year I broke my collarbone, and prior to breaking my collarbone before this game, I'd been driven by this very wealthy guy. In fact, he was his wife was the manager of the Osmonds, Donny Osmonds, remember the Osmond brothers? And he drove a Rolls Royce. And I remember the conversation in the backseat as him and his friend were up front driving to this game of rugby about all these terrible council estates that were popping up left, right, and centre. Wasn't it a shame? Was it a terrible shame? Blight on the landscape. And I'd never thought about myself being of another class until that moment. And when I broke my collarbone, I went to the hospital, I was fixed up, and I was meant to be driven home by the same man who drove the Rolls Royce. And I was so ashamed that I wouldn't let him drive me to my own home. I pretended to live in a rather leafy outskirts of Luton, in a kind of area where there were detached houses. So there was that element. But other than that, I felt really enlivened, excited, and I felt I was in the right place.
And was there any indication that you would take a creative writing journey when you were at school?
No, because my whole education was geared towards me getting into medical school. When I was 10, my father sat me down on the edge of the bed where all these decisions were made in his bedroom, and he informed me that I was going to be a doctor. And so that was the project from the age of 10 to the age of 18, project get Colin into medical school. And that's what I did. There was no other thought in my head other than to realize this dream of my parents, and to a lesser degree, my own dream, I suppose.
We're going to return to this theme because it really is very interesting, but it leads us very nicely into our next archive clip, which is from the author Jane Shilling. She writes memoir, much like you do. Let's hear from Jane.
As a writer of memoir, the thing that's haunted me throughout my writing life of two books is not so much what I'm prepared to kind of say about myself, but what it's all right to say about other people and who owns the narrative, if you like, because, you think you're telling your own story, but actually you're telling your own story and that of your parents, your son, the people you worked with, all those other stories, and to what extent you can use those. I mean, there's the chip of ice is one thing, but I suppose I begin to feel more compunction, actually. I didn't feel very much in my first couple of books. Certainly one person who's sort of close to me would be completely appalled if I were to write anything. And so I'm in this sort of very curious position of pretending that I don't have this relationship, that I'm unable to write about it. And even now I'm writing fiction, I'm writing about a real person, and that throws up a whole new, different set of problems, to what extent, what do I leave out of her life? What do I put in? Is it all right to imagine conversations and feelings and things like that? So one's constantly haunted by the ethics of writing, whether it's memoir or fiction.
So as Jane says, there's always tension between the pursuit of uncensored truth and the ethics of impacting the lives of real people. Has this ever constrained you in writing memoir?
First thing I'd say to Jane is give yourself a break, Jane. Actually, you're a storyteller. Obviously, you are sensitive because you've paid attention to what's around you, and you have as much right to tell the story as anybody else. And I think sometimes it's important to tell those stories. I haven't been constrained because I recognize that there aren't many storytellers who get published in my family. And I think we have an interesting story to tell. And in fact, I felt it was an imperative that I did tell those stories which I tell. There's also a devil on your shoulder saying you can't do that, or you're no good, or who wants to hear your bloody story anyway. And I just think you have to banish those demons. And in a way, as long as you write with a good heart, I think you're going to be in the clear. You got unclear, as we say in Jamaica. I always take the precaution of, if I'm going to write non-fiction, of alerting people who are going to be in the book in advance. I let them know I'm clear that they're going to be included. And often that might be family members. And in a way, my approach has been to paint myself not as the hero. The temptation is always to cast yourself as the hero. So I allow my siblings to be the heroes in my stories. And in a way, there's no such thing, as the Jamaicans say, there's no such things as facts. There are versions of facts. Now, in a way, I would qualify that by saying there are facts, there are verifiable truths, but I think we curate the facts as storytellers. We leave in some things, we take out some things. And I've always said to my siblings, if I've forgotten something, well, maybe you can help me fill in the facts as you recall them. And it makes for a much more rich and rewarding story, I think. But obviously there is an imperative to make sure that you don't cross some sort of moral or ethical boundary and remain true to what you remembered the facts to be. And that's, I think, is the difference between biography and memoir. Memoir is the evocation of facts rather than the transcription of verifiable facts.
So you said that you don't like to center yourself. In A Smell of Burning, you obviously center your brother, and reviewers have pointed out that you've created this kind of view of Western history and the way that we've seen epilepsy and how it kind of offers evidence of the way humanity persecutes people who've suffered from this. What I like about the book is I learned so much. I learned about your brother, I learned about you, but I also learned about epilepsy and well-known sufferers who I'd never come across before. Tell me a bit more about your journey with that book.
Yeah, well, I was very determined to have a kind of holistic picture of epilepsy. So the book is both, well, it's three things. It's a story of my brother's epilepsy from the age of 14 when he developed epilepsy until the age he died when he was 38. He died from what's called sudden, unexpected death in epilepsy. But also it's a kind of cultural history of epilepsy. How is epilepsy represented in books, in films, in television, in plays? So, for instance, I read a lot about Dostoevsky, who had epilepsy, and one of the main characters in one of his most famous books, The Idiot, also has epilepsy. And in fact, Dostoevsky said that if he could be cured of epilepsy, but it meant losing the sense of the aura, this ecstatic aura that he had whenever he was about to receive a seizure, he wouldn't want to be cured. So I was interested in kind of complicated the notion of what should be a desirable outcome to have an epilepsy and what necessarily isn't. But also I wanted to chart the history of how epilepsy had been treated. But when I came to construct the book, I thought, well, what story, what structure, what architecture can I frame? Can I hang this story on? And I recall the fact that when my brother had these seizures, in layperson's terms, he had grand mal seizures. These are the big seizures that you lose consciousness and you recover eventually. And I was there at all the major seizures that he had and saw this sort of transformation as he reawoke. He was reawakened. He went and he almost died, but then he came back to life. And I reckon that his epilepsy was his cross that he had to bear throughout his life. And I was brought up Catholic. I was an altar boy for 7 years. And I was very transfixed by the notion of the Stations of the Cross. And so when it came to the construction of that book, I saw that each of my brother's seizures was like a station of the cross. He picks up this cross when he's 14, has his epilepsy, he's got the diagnosis, and he has these stages, these big epileptic seizures every year almost, sometimes twice a year, until the age of 13, when he dies from epilepsy. He's crucified by his epilepsy. So I wanted to, in a way, to encourage people to have empathy for him and to put themselves in his shoes through the book. But what I really loved about the book, in all honesty, Juliet, was that when you have a friend, a relation who dies, not only does their body disappear, but all the stories, all the ways of speaking, all the memories disappear as well. And I was really delighted that when I read that book, I was at least able to converse with my dead brother for 3 years and to recall some of those stories.
I think that's the power of the book. And I think that's what I enjoyed about it the most. But also it allowed me to get to know you. I've read your other works, but I honestly think that this is the one that impacted me the most. And I was able to take a real, journey with that and to learn about Christopher. Obviously, at the beginning of the book, you talk about being in medical school and having to review a patient who is suffering from epilepsy. Was that the beginning of the end of your medical career, do you think?
Well, I think all through my medical years at the London Hospital in Whitechapel, where I was a student in the 80s, I was very aware of this notion that there was them and us, and I didn't like it. Them were the patients, and us were the the people who were charmed, middle class, would not suffer from illness, were immortal. And I never liked the way that the patients were treated, and I always had a lot of empathy for them. But I loved the storytelling, because when you sit down with the patient, the most important thing is to get not just their medical history, but their social history. And so that was the beginning of my interest in writing, actually. I stuck out medicine for 5 years in order to honor my parents' sacrifice, but I should have stopped after 5 days, really. And with hindsight, even though I didn't practice medicine in the end, I got a lot of interesting stories and a lot of interesting perspectives on writing through my time at the London Hospital. I'll give you one short story. So when you start as a medical student, you're taught pathology. And we had this pathologist who encouraged us to think pathology all the time. So as a student, you're walking down Whitechapel High Street. There's a man bent over, got a mirror in his hand. Half his nose is missing. What's that? Oh, that's tertiary syphilis. You're walking down Brick Lane. A Bengali woman hocks into the pavement. There's blood in the sputum. What's that? Oh, that's probably tuberculosis. So all the time that I was at medical school, we were taught to think pathology, to think of people as walking pathology. And it took a long while for me to rid my way of thinking about people in that way, to think of them as candidates for compassion, to think about them as someone who was requiring pathos. So in a way, I got a lot of interesting ideas and notions and interactions with people at medical school, but I had to rid myself of the way that they pathologized everybody.
Did it help your writing, though? Did it help you to be forensic about the way you...
Well, I have had some criticism about the fact that people think I'm a bit cold and withdrawn and look at people in a kind of very distilled way without any kind of emotional input. And I don't think that is true of me, but I think it allows me to think more clearly about what it is that I'm looking at, and not to think of people who are just, in a way, assets for the story. If I get too emotionally involved, I'm not able to write the story. And I want to, in a way, put myself out of the frame in order for the real person, for the subject of the story to be revealed.
In your book, I'm Black, So You Don't Have to Be, it was something that really stood out for me. And, you said that when you were younger, you were always terrified of people finding out, what you were really feeling.
Yes. So I think a lot of Black people, in my experience anyway, when they're growing up, they're taught to be wary of white people in this country. Because when I was growing up in the 60s, we weren't liked. Maybe we're not liked now, but it was kind of clear that if you weren't careful, people could take information from you and use it against you. And so I was brought up, I'm sure you're familiar with this phrase, Juliet, to play fool to catch wise, which is a kind of Caribbean saying which comes from slavery, actually. And it means to disabuse people of the notion that you constitute a threat. So you don't reveal yourself. You pretend yourself to be slightly bit silly, not quite as smart as them. You placate them. But it means that you get through life unmolested. That was the plan. And that was the way that we were brought up, in all honesty. And to a large degree, until one or two hiccups in the BBC, it seemed to work.
That very nicely brings us on to the next theme of journalism, because I'd love to speak to you about, your experience at Bush House. But we have a clip from the archive of Vitaly Vitaliev, a UK-based multi-award-winning and fully bilingual author. He was born in Ukraine, and he's a columnist, editor, and broadcaster. Here he is recalling his interview with world-famous ballet dancer Rudolf Nureyev.
Vitaly Vitaliev, in memoriam, Dance in Peace. January 2023 marks the 30th anniversary of the untimely death of Rudolf Nureyev, the greatest ballet dancer of modern times, whom I met several months prior to his passing. Nureyev came to Melbourne at the end of 1992 during his farewell tour with the Stars of the World Ballet. He only agreed to be interviewed by one Melbourne journalist, and together with his manager, Michael Elgley, he chose me. After my defection from the USSR, I was then living in Australia, where I worked as a senior writer and syndicated columnist for one of the world's biggest newspapers, the Melbourne Age. It was to be Nureyev's last major interview. I was rather taken aback when I entered his hotel room and saw the legendary dancer sitting in an armchair, with his long-fingered, sinewy hands resting on his lap like two tired birds, whose flight was almost over. He was a shadow of the Nureyev we all knew, thin and stooped, as if withered and bent by some inhuman burden. His tragic and slightly slanting Tatar eyes were filled with pain and that special kind of rueful wisdom that can only be found in the eyes of the terminally ill. His eyes were filled with doom, to which they seemed to have quietly succumbed. His voice was hoarse and weak, almost a whisper. His face, with hollow cheeks and protruding cheekbones, was that of a martyr and a long-time sufferer. It was also the somewhat faded face of a dreamer boy from the smoky industrial city of Ufa in the Urals, eagerly watching the trains rattling away towards lands mysterious and unknown. Yes, just like myself, Nureyev had been a train spotter and an armchair traveler when a teenager. He told me that he was born on a train and added gently, "Yes, I'm a vagabond." From childhood, he had been fascinated by the sight of a train crossing the bridge over the Ufa River on its way to Siberia and the Soviet Far East. This haunting sound of the train filled me with nostalgia and longing to see other places. I could not believe my ears. One of the world's greatest artists was speaking out my own innermost thoughts. When I suggested we spoke Russian, he shook his head and muttered decisively, "English." I didn't blame him. The scar left on the artist's soul by the Soviet regime must have been too painful to touch. He told me how at school he was tormented by both kids and teachers for his passion to dance and was routinely ridiculed as a queer. Do you know what's in my old school building now? A choreographic school, by sheer coincidence. What an irony. I thought then it was not an irony, but a victory. A decisive victory of sparkling art over drab reality, of dancing as a way of life as opposed to standing at attention and marking time, of talent over mediocrity. He talked about his now famous leap to freedom at a Paris airport in 1961, about his life in ballet, about his dancing partners. At the mention of Margot Fonteyn, his eyes lit up momentarily, then dimmed again. I asked him, "Do you have many friends?" "No," he replied after a pause. "My best friends are all dead, and now I don't have any." Nureyev had very sad memories of Russia and claimed he was not at all nostalgic for the place. It hasn't changed. They're the same people. They will never change. Russian ballet, it stopped growing a long time ago and hasn't created anything new of late. I asked him, "Are you happy with your life?" He was silent for a long while and then said, "I think I have achieved quite a lot, but there's one more thing I'd like to do. Now that my dancing career is over, I want to conduct, to become a good orchestral conductor. I think I will be able to do this. I thought that was an expression of hope, dum spiro spero, rather than fate. At the time, I was thinking of writing a film script about Olga Spesivtseva, the famous Russian émigré ballerina of the 1920s, 1930s. I told Nureyev about it and asked whether he would fancy playing the early 20th century dancer and choreographer Václav Nijinsky in such a film, had it ever come to fruition. I'm too old for that, he said. To play Nijinsky, one should be much younger. I spent almost 2 hours with Nureyev. At some point in our conversation, a young photographer from my newspaper came in and rather cheekily asked Nureyev to do a jeté, a high ballet leap, for the photo. Nureyev got off his chair and, suppressing the grimace of pain with a forced half-smile, extended one leg slightly and then jumped off the floor with the other. For a fleeting moment, he was floating in the air like an albatross, like the young Nureyev at the height of his fame. And that was the image on the photo that later accompanied the interview. It was time to say goodbye. Before leaving, I asked Nureyev for an autograph for my son. What's his name? Mitya, a good Russian name, he said with sudden warmth. How old is he? And instead of just a signature, he wrote a cordial little message. Dear Mitya, I wish you all the best in this life and hope you will be happy. He was saying goodbye to this life. Next evening, I saw Nureyev dance at Melbourne's National Theatre. It was not strictly dancing, he was just slowly walking on stage. But there was so much grace in his every movement that it did feel like a classical dance. In one of his life's last performances, he was playing Faun in Debussy's one-act ballet L'après-midi d'un Faun, at the end of which his character dies. A storm of applause came when the curtain fell and Nureyev's motionless figure disappeared behind it. He didn't emerge for the curtain call. I knew I would never see him again. Several months later, on a grey February morning, I was standing near Nureyev's fresh grave, still overlaid with wreaths and fading flowers, at the Russian cemetery in Saint-Geneviève-de-Bois, a sleepy suburban town near Paris. Dance in peace was carved on the tombstone.
I love the fact that Vitaly bonded over train spotting with Rudolf Nureyev. You've written extensively about Bob Marley, the biography I and I, The Natural Mystics, Marley, Tosh and Whaler. Did you feel that you bonded with these amazing musicians, particularly Marley, and why?
Yeah, I did. I felt very close to them. What I loved about Vitaly's piece there was his humanity comes through, his sense of being on the side of Nureyev and bringing out a side of Nureyev that maybe people didn't know about. So I really, really was delighted to hear that. And that's something I've tried to do with my own writing. Caribbean people can be a little bit tricky. Musicians can be even trickier because a lot of the musicians that I interviewed for I and I, The Natural Mystics, my book on the Whalers, had been exploited by music managers over the years. And so they were rather wary of someone whom they saw as a journalist. So I had to disabuse them of the idea that even though I was a journalist, my intention was to reveal themselves to other people, but also to themselves. In Jamaica, we say, don't be a carry-down artist. And I would always say that to my interviewees, I'm not going to bring you down, I'm going to elevate you. That was my approach.
Also in your biography, I think it's very clear that you are drawn to complexity, characters who are perhaps outsiders. And I think you also described Bob Marley as a saviour. During your time at the BBC, you found yourself under relentless pressure to conform. And as I said earlier, you had earned notoriety as the most disciplined BBC employee. How does your resonance with the likes of Bob Marley relate to how you had to stand up for yourself and your identity while you were facing these disciplinary hearings?
Yeah, well, Bob Marley had a clean heart. I think I have a clean heart. Bob Marley was a man of peace, a man of love, but he's also a very feisty character. Do you want to get on the wrong side of Bob Marley? He'd tell you what's what. And he had to in order to carve out a life for himself beyond the hard lives of a ghetto trench town in Jamaica. So I was delighted to think of him as a kind of role model in a way. And also I was maybe wrong to pay too much attention to the way that he would tell the truth as he saw it. Because maybe sometimes you have to think about what currency you have, what currency you can expend by telling the truth. And so when Bob Marley had brothers around him, Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer, they were brothers. They may not have been blood brothers, but they were brothers in the trade, and they were Rastafarians. And there's a kind of whole cohort of people around him that spoke the way that he did. So he wasn't speaking by himself. When I first joined the BBC, like a lot of people of colour, black people, I dialed down my colour. In all honesty, I dialed down my colour in a kind of playful to catch wise way in order to make them understand that I'm more like them than not. I'm not a threat to them. The status quo can continue. And that was the case for maybe 10 or 15 years. And then after a while, I thought, I'm in the clear now. I can reveal myself. Who told me to do that? So what you realize after a while is that you can't question authority with humor. And I'm a bit mischievous in the way that I speak, perhaps, and I like to challenge authority. And that did me no good because then you get cast as some sort of stereotype. So eventually I got cast, and I resented it. I got cast as a tall, angry black man. And that's not the way I see myself. That's not what I see when I look in the mirror in the morning. So I remember being accused of being tall and aggressive because I'd made a joke about not wanting to comply to the change of our environment to make everything open plan. And I said, don't, that open plan, I hate the idea of open plan. That's like a slave plantation with a big one and a big house looking over the enslaved people. And I was making a joke about surveillance. But the person I said that to said that I was accusing her of wanting to be a slave owner. It's kind of ludicrous, really. Anyway, I was invited for a disciplinary hearing. And at this disciplinary hearing, I was accused of being aggressive. And I said, I'm not having that. As you know, Julia, over the decades, centuries, black people have been accused of being aggressive. And it's a weapon that is used against you no matter what you are. And so I say, I'm not having that. That's not me. If I was tall, white, Oxford educated, you wouldn't say I was aggressive. You'd say I was assertive. So I'll accept that word. I'm not accepting aggressive. But I'm here today to say that I survived all 4 hearings. I survived all 4 appeals, and I wasn't going to let them drum me out. So I stuck it out for much longer than I should do after I had my 4th disciplinary hearing. People were saying, well, why are you there? Because I didn't want all of the sacrifices that my parents had made in order to put me through medical school, then the BBC, just for somebody to turn around and say, well, that matters nothing. You're just some nasty, gold-toothed, ragamuffin yard boy from Brixton, probably, aren't you? And I wasn't having it.
Unfortunately, it didn't hold you back. I mean, I think that there are people who would have been crushed by that experience. I mean, my memory of you was as a self-assured, tall, 6'3", black man with shark acumen. But I also know from that experience that there would have been people who would have found that very challenging.
Yeah.
And I think what they also kind of misread about people like us and our culture, I mean, you describe Caribbean humour. It's this tradition of pickong. I mean, my mother's from Trinidad. I was brought up around calypso. And in a lot of our music, it's bold and verbal jousting.
Yeah.
But I also see you as someone who's bold and will joust verbally.
Yeah. And I think it should be said that it depends which part of the BBC you find yourself in. I think if my verbal jousting had been in the newsroom, I'd be fine because they're a bit more robust and they can take a little bit of sarcasm or jesting or challenge. But in some other parts, they're less robust and they're more intimidated by their own managers. But having said all that, I did get some stories out of it, and I did manage to weave some of those stories into the writing that I do. So even in times of adversity, there's still things that you can cast in a way which changes the narrative, change the story in a way that doesn't depict you and damage you as some sort of victim, says, actually, there's some things going on here that are kind of interesting to interrogate. Let's try and work out what was really going on.
I think it speaks to the need as a writer and whereas we're self-employed, the importance of creative resilience and emotional resilience.
Yeah, I've got a little pea shooter here, but I'm still going to match them with my pea shooter because, in fact, their guns, their shells will jam, they'll fall awry, and when the smoke clears, I'll still be standing.
You do praise the BBC for having the foresight to create Caribbean Voices, which was broadcast between, it was in the 1940s and 50s, encouraging, fledgling writers to send their stories. How important was that programme?
I think it was hugely important. It made me feel that I was part of some lineage when I started writing, and it made me interrogate their work. Because when I was growing up in Luton, the capital of Britain, Juliet, there were no Caribbean writers in the libraries that I could find. Any book that had a Caribbean or black person, I remember reading a book by Colin McInnes, very fine writer, absolute beginners. This is a white man writing about black people in Notting Hill Gate. When I was growing up, I couldn't find Caribbean writers. I found African-American writers like James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison. But it took me years, probably not until I came to the BBC, did I realize that there had been a tradition of Caribbean writing promoted by the BBC from the 40s and 50s onwards. So they were like my ancestors. They were my literary ancestors, and I devoured them.
Are you a professional writer struggling with financial difficulties? The Royal Literary Fund is here to support you. At the RLF, we believe that every writer deserves the chance to thrive, no matter what life throws your way. We offer a variety of hardship grants tailored to help professional writers in need, whether it's short-term relief or ongoing support. Perhaps you're dealing with an unexpected expense, a drop in income, or facing challenges that make writing difficult, such as illness, disability, or now relying on your pension. If you're eligible, our grants team will walk you through our discreet and confidential application process, ensuring you receive the support you need. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and inquire today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
That brings us very nicely on to our next theme, which really is identity and migration. And we're going to have a clip from WritersMosaic. But I'm going to let you introduce this writer, Colin.
This is a fantastic writer called Isabelle Dupuy, who has Haitian parentage. She's actually born in America, but then her parents were from Haiti and they brought her back to Haiti when she was a child of 4 or 5. And what I love about this clip is you're going to hear Isabelle talk about that when she comes here, she has a rather, she has a reluctance to pay her taxes.
When I came here, I didn't believe in paying taxes because I was like, why would I want to do that? I did not come from a high trust society. And so I did not assume any society would be high trust. I just thought some people were better at exploiting others. That's it. And so, for example, and now that I would never, ever do that, but I voted Tory. Because I thought, why would I vote for people who want to tax me more?
So she was brought up in a society where there was no safety net. So it's every man for himself. It's kind of why people might even vote in America for Donald Trump, even though they've come from Cuba or somewhere where people are struggling, because they've come from societies where there is nobody out there to help you other than yourself. But she turned things around when she realized that there was benefits to paying your tax because it meant you could have a service like the National Health Service. That really opened her eyes to the benefits of being in a society like ours. But she's a wonderful storyteller, and she tells the story about when she went from America back to her parents' homeland in Haiti, and it's quite a transformation.
When I was in New York, I used to go to school with a school bus, as many American children do. And then when we got to Haiti, my mother signed us up to go to school on a Haitian school bus. But in Haiti, at that time, the school buses were a private business. So you would have a guy and he would buy a little bus or a minivan and call it a school bus, and everybody would pay a subscription to go to school on this in this van. And so there was a guy, and his name was Viello, and he had a Daihatsu minivan, a real third world thing, which very narrow and basically could seat like 9 or 10 people. and he would sell 25 tickets to put 25 kids in there with no air conditioning and jammed windows. And it would stink. Like the mornings were okay, but in the afternoons on the way home, after, kids playing in the Caribbean and dirt all day, it was really bad. And so we would overflow, because we were all stuffed at the back of this thing, into the driving area in front. And he kept a whip under the visor. And so to keep you from overflowing on him as he drove. And so if you overflew on him in the front, he would just take out the whip, and while he was driving, would just whip at the back to keep you back. And I remember I went home after this, and I said to my mother, this is very different from the New York bus. And she was like, welcome home.
I love that story because she tells it so well. She's a consummate storyteller, Isabelle Dupuy. She has a lot of flair. There's detail, there's divine detail. She transforms the story, and she takes you with her. You're on that bus in Haiti with the bus driver with his whip. And then he has that wonderful punchline when she recounts the story to her mother, and the mother says, welcome home. I just love that story. That's my ideal of any story in a storytelling format like oral history, which is what this project is about. This excerpt you just heard is part of a series of podcasts on the Royalty Fund's Writers Mosaic platform, which is telling these stories of migration to Britain and giving truth to the lie of the fact that we are a homogenous culture. We've never been a homogenous culture. We've always been heterogeneous culture. So it's saying, actually, this country is a land of migrants.
Does your role as director of Writers Mosaic help you to write stories like Homecoming, Voice of the Windrush Generation?
I think it does, because what we do on Writers Mosaic is we say to each other and to the people who write for Writers Mosaic, which is a platform for writers of the global majority, that actually sometimes you're boxed into a corner and told this is what you should write about. This is what your specialist area is. But what we want to do is to break down that stereotype and say, well, write what is dear to you. And write about love, write about humor, write about jesting. Don't feel you have to write about blackness or identity or victimhood. Write about joy. And what I got from the collection Homecoming, which is an oral history of migration to Britain, is the resilience of people who came here from the Caribbean in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and their sense of bringing joy with them. And when I sit down and read my own books, like Homecoming, and read some of the things that are widely available on Writers Mosaic, it reinforces my joy in writing, my joy to expand what I write and what I can write. And so, in a way, I think my own writing becomes deeper through an immersion in Writers Mosaic.
And how did you research Homecoming?
Well, everything starts with your mother, doesn't it?
Very true.
My mother's a great storyteller, and she would just tell me these fantastic stories. I remember when I was reading The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvon, and have this wonderful cast of characters who are coming to Britain for the first time. They're sometimes greeted by someone who's been there a bit longer. And I remember thinking, well, whatever happened? What would have become of these characters? It's all set in the 50s, 56, I think it was published. And so I thought, well, it would be great to imagine what these characters would be now, 40, 50 years later. So that was the impetus. And then I just sat down with my mum, and she gave me some ideas about who to start off talking with. And each person I spoke to passed on the baton to the next person. And it became this sort of wonderful tapestry of people taking me around the country. And what was lovely is to find out why people ended up where they do in Britain. So in the Caribbean, people came here. But if you were from St. Kitts, you end up in Leeds. If you're from St. Vincent, you end up in High Wycombe. And I was really intrigued to sort of work out why they ended up in those locations. But it meant that for a while, even though I'm from one of those arrogant islands, which is Jamaica, the Jamaicans are very arrogant people who take up too much room in the culture, make too much noise. I was determined to kind of keep the Jamaicans out and make room for the other islanders who sometimes are a bit eclipsed by the Jamaicans.
Thank you. I appreciate that because you have said that, in Luton, Black communities were getting to know each other. They weren't really island hoppers. And I have to disagree with you on that because I'm wondering whether Jamaicans are more isolationist. So, for example, my mum's from Trinidad, her father's from Guyana, my dad's from Barbados. We've got family in Panama and Cuba because people migrated to work. So my heritage is from island hoppers. Whereas Jamaicans, I feel as if you're right, they have a different kind of identity.
Yeah. I mean, they have an identity of moving. So even from the early 1900s, 10,000 people a year migrated or left the islands to go and find work in Miami or Florida anyway, or America. So this is a great tradition of leaving the island, but leaving the island to go to America, North America, not leaving the island to go to another island. And there was this notion that they are the best people in the Caribbean, the Jamaicans. But, I'm sure every islander says that about themselves.
Of course.
Yeah. But we were, in a way, I mean, what I loved about my books and writing about homecoming, writing about Bad Guy at the Wheel, is that what you found, although they had this notion about themselves in Jamaica, it really changed when they came to England, because then they met other Caribbean people. And so all the people that I grew up with were from Antigua, St. Vincent, Trinidad. They weren't just Jamaicans. And there was a real sense of them becoming West Indians in England. They weren't West Indians in the West Indies. They were Jamaican, they were Trinidadian. But they became West Indians here because they were forced to club together because of the adversity in which they found themselves in.
Yeah, I do like that comment. Yeah, it is, unification after kind of dislocation.
Yeah, absolutely.
That brings us nicely to your writing process. I'd like to know a bit more about that, but we're going to hear first from Diana Evans, an award-winning novelist, journalist, and critic.
Remove bracelets. There must be tea, peppermint. There must be silence, only birds or trees or occasional traffic, otherwise insert earplugs. Light must enter through a window or skylight, and preferably there is height, a proximity to the galaxies. I have never liked writing on a ground floor. And there must be no web at the tap of my fingertips, only words aloud. The world is banished. I am utterly alone. How else to attempt to transfer the stuff of life into the bare, white, rectangular pages of a novel? Novels are like sea lions. They slip from your grasp. They jump off distant rocks and make big splashes that catch your clothes and make you feel it, the whole thing, the thing that you're trying to capture. Then when you try to catch it, it dives under, takes off, laughs at you, peeps at you when you're becoming desperate with something like sympathy, but retreats again when you walk up close. It does not want to be captured. It does not want to be rectangular. It wants to live its life in peace. There are things I do to make things easier, and some work and some don't. I make notes to keep me connected to the story. I keep them in a plastic box with a lid and look at them when I'm lost. I'm often lost, but you can make too many notes when you're lost and cling to them too tightly. Once, my sea lion was on the floor, groaning. He was plastered to my laminate with little neatly arranged pieces of paper containing lists and buzzwords indicating what was in each chapter. He didn't like it there at all. I had to let him go and accept that I was lost and wait for him to splash me again. But one thing sea lions do like is music. The one I'm working with now especially likes Michael Jackson and also the R&B singer John Legend. All it takes sometimes is to hear that shamone or a thriller shriek or a beat it beat, and all of a sudden I know exactly where I am, exactly what I'm doing in this difficult silence, and the sea lion is right there, sitting in my lap and licking my face. He doesn't stay long though, so I have to play some more music. When the music doesn't work anymore, I know I'm really in trouble. One day we swim into shore, me and my words. There is a novel there in the rectangles and it looks not so bad, not perfect, but likeable, like something I would wear myself. By this stage, we're exhausted with one another. I say, I never want to see you again. It says, I never asked to be born. So we go our separate ways and see each other sometimes at book readings, but it's always uncomfortable. We have nothing more to say to one another.
So having heard Diana, how would you describe your writing process?
Well, I think I'm less sensitive than Diana. I know a lot of writers who have to have the special environment, but I can write anywhere, really, because I think you create the world in your head wherever you are. You're going to laugh at this, but I can write at the gym on one of those cycling machines. Get my little phone out, get my notepad out of my phone, and I start writing on my phone.
That's amazing.
But also, I kind of recognize that actually all these ideas are swirling around your head anyway. And if you convince yourself that you need a special quiet space, you might be in trouble because sometimes those spaces are difficult to find and it might deter you from writing. So I've never really had a quiet space. There's always noise, but I've always managed to have an internal migration.
I love that. I think if you're a writer, you're a writer, and you're right. I mean, you're listening, you're observing, and you just create, you express yourself.
But we have interesting differences, some of my friends and I, who talk about the fact that, they might write a sentence in the morning and they cross it out in the afternoon and their work is done. I think, you what? You're not working hard enough and you're indulging yourself. So I don't have the luxury of indulging myself because I want to get more and more writing done. And I realize I've got this sort of store of stories that need to get out there before I'm lowered into the ground.
Do you think that drive comes from your parents?
Yeah, I think a lot of migrants have a will and determination to better themselves. And quite often the children of those migrants inherit that tradition. I'm sure you got the same from your parents that, no one's going to give you any favors. You've got to go out there and grab things. And you grab things by having enough acumen, enough skill sets, enough education, enough determination to make sure that you live a fulfilling life. And I've always thought that that's really important.
Does music play a part in
writing? I used to write plays at medical school. That's kind of when the real writing began, when I was writing plays. I remember writing a play about dissection. It was called The Dissectors, I think it was called. It might have been called The Clinic. And at the time, a film had just come out called Paris, Texas. I think it's a Wim Wenders film. And the soundtrack for that film is by Ry Cooder. And I played that soundtrack non-stop when I was writing a play about dissection. It just seemed to be perfect. Other people have different associations with the music, but it took me to the dissection room and it allowed me to write in a kind of clearer way about the gruesome business of dissecting cadavers.
That's really interesting. I know Ry Cooder mainly from the Buena Vista Social Club in Cuba, but I will have to go back and
check out Paris, Texas. It's a fantastic soundtrack.
It's very evocative. I can just about hear it.
I think also, in all honesty, why I loved it was because I was a solitary human being at medical school. I lived in a shared house, but often I wouldn't go out and play with the other students. Every Friday, I had a friend called Cameron Sting Man. He was a party person, and he'd come down, aftershave, dripping from me and say, right, let's get hoolied. Let's go to the West End and get hoolied. And I would never get hoolied. I was always on my own, and I liked being by myself. And I just get really annoyed sometimes when there'd be parties in the shared house, and I'd be probably writing a play or something in my room and didn't come down to the party. And at 2:00 in the morning, the party would still be going on. I was just in this shared house with other medical students. And at 2:15, I'd go down and say, can you turn the music down? And they say, yeah. And they'd turn the notch from 11 to maybe 10. And then as soon as I back into my room, they'd go back up to 11. And after about 2 or 3 of these sort of failed attempts at getting them to turn the music down, I inevitably would go down, I'd find the plug, and I would rip the plug from the lead and take the plug with me to my bedroom. And the music finished.
I think you're very jousty.
Yeah. I think I was also thinking that they needed to go to bed and prepare themselves for the next day at medical school.
Yeah, I think, training to be a doctor is very serious business. So,
I agree.
So we're coming to the end of our session. I would like to end with a quote by Franz Kafka. Don't bend, don't water it down. Don't try to make it logical. Don't edit your own soul according to the fashion. Rather, follow your most intense obsessions mercilessly. I think of you when I saw that quote.
Oh, thank you.
In what way does this kind of define your artistic adventure?
Yeah, I think follow the path that you believe will lead to a rewarding life. I always say to people, whenever I meet them, when I depart from them, I say, walk good, which you all know the phrase. It means try to lead a commendable life. And I've tried to walk good through my writing. I would say that I have bended, though. I will bend. I love that quote by Kafka, but I also think of Claudius the god, who survived by being like a reed in the wind, bending where necessary, bending to the point that you won't break. I also love that title from Norman Beaton's book, Beaten but Unbowed. I think I'll have that on my gravestone, beaten but unbowed.
That's wonderful. And Colin, that brings our session to an end. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Juliet. It's been a real pleasure.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.